Today is January 1st, 2007, and behind the camera is Dr. Dolores Augustine of St. John's University, New York, and I am interviewing Mr. Reginald C. Augustine about the Alsace mission. So go ahead. You can start talking to us about what you did on the Alsace mission.
Well, in May of 1944, when I was an administrative officer at an Air Force flying training school in Arkansas, one day my commanding officer called me in, said that he had received from Washington a cable asking if I could be sent to Washington for interview in connection with a special War Department intelligence mission. And my commanding officer agreed that that would happen. And so I packed my suitcase, went to Washington, and met the commanding officer of this new unit, the Alsace mission, which was designed, it turned out, to find out how far the Germans had progressed in the construction of an atomic bomb. This seemed to be a very important question from the point of view of the American Scientific Commission, because many of the best American scientists of that period had studied in Germany, at which time it was generally considered that German science was far superior to the American, and that as a consequence, the Germans were probably well ahead of us in atomic research. It was at that time that Albert Einstein wrote his famous letter to President Roosevelt suggesting that America should get into the business of creating an atomic bomb to catch up with the Germans. And at the same time, the Americans scientific committee was very much concerned about how far the Germans had progressed, and so a military commission was formed to go into the combat areas of Western Europe as soon as suitable targets were identified and taken into American possession and were military control. Colonel Pash interviewed me. It seems that his main concern was to find American military personnel who had traveled extensively in Europe and who were familiar with some of the European languages. And since I had spent about 4 of the last 5 years, let's say 4 of the preceding 5 years, in Europe and North Africa, and spoke serviceable French and German, that I was a suitable candidate for this position that he wanted to fulfill. And after he had talked with me for a day or so, he decided I was the man. And so for the rest of World War II, that was the organization to which I was assigned and where I did most of my work. After the American troops had landed in Normandy and had advanced almost as far as Paris, I was then sent to Germany, sent to England to await the transport into the war zones of France and Germany. It seems that our first target was for Joliot-Curie in Paris, but he was unable to shed much light on the German atomic research.
Had he collaborated with the Nazis?
And there is no evidence that he had collaborated or had been asked to collaborate with.
And so basically he just didn't know anything. He was out of the loop because he was just a scientist working for a defeated
that's right.
country.
That's right. And but before we made our next move, Colonel Pash received from Washington a cable saying that Washington had information on the location of considerable quantities of uranium ore in Belgium, and asked Colonel Pash to pursue that lead. So one day, now Belgium at that time was under British Army control, to the extent that it had been, the Germans had been rolled back. And so we formed a part of a convoy that went into Brussels and Antwerp for the purpose of tracking down this the atomic ore that they had spoken of. My role in this was simply as a translator and questioner of the French-speaking Belgian authorities at that time. Fighting was still going on in Antwerp at that time, and so when we went to the installation where the atomic material was stored, there were mortar shells flying overhead between the Germans on the other side of the Albert Canal and the Americans to the rear of the factory where we were sitting. So we cut it short, but did identify large quantities which eventually were picked up by the British and Americans and shipped to the United States for use in atomic research and development of our own bomb. But at the same time, we found that there were 6 carloads of atomic material that had been shipped from Belgium when the Germans conquered that country in 1940, and had been shipped somewhere into the south of France. And so our next problem was to form a little mission to go down into the south of France, locate that material, and also make it available to the American bomb production, atomic bomb production activities. So there were a half a dozen or so of us with 2 or 3 jeeps, drivers, and we were accompanied by a major advance of the Manhattan Project, that is the American atomic research, military research committee. And
can I just ask which of the Allies was occupying southern France?
At that time, the south of France was essentially a no man's land. It was occupied by the French forces of the interior, that is, the French resistance forces to the Germans. Unfortunately, at that time, these French forces were divided between the communist and the non-communist elements, who not only did not collaborate with one another, but were to a certain extent competing with one another and not collaborating in any way. Our instructions were, first of all, to go to a certain chateau in the south of France, in the vicinity of Limoges, where there was a representative of a French company that was also participating in the exploitation of uranium ore from the Belgian Congo, and he, from that point on, assisted us in our research, in our search for the missing uranium. He accompanied us to Marseille, first of all to Toulouse, where was located the French the French facilities where their atomic material was stored, and we entered the factory there. Colonel Major Vance of the Manhattan Project and I located some barrels that were suspicious. Major Vance had a Geiger counter, determined that there was atomic material located in those barrels. It turned out that there were about 85 barrels of that material, and so naturally this was far more volume, a far greater volume of a material than we could transport with our jeeps and so forth. So Colonel Pash at that point returned to Paris and enlisted the support of the transportation authorities, the American Army transportation authorities, and who turned out to be quite generous. They gave us a fleet of American trucks that had been used up to that point for transporting material from Antwerp to the front lines, and this entire fleet of trucks came rumbling down to Toulouse and to pick up the material. The officer in charge, the French officer in charge of the factory there, was a bit reluctant, but Colonel Pash, as a bluff, had some of our troops sitting with their weapons clearly in view just outside the door, and the French officer reluctantly said, "Go ahead," and so the material was picked up and transported from there down to Marseille to be transported to the United States, and I was in charge of that particular movement down to Marseille, and there were American transport boats that picked up the atomic material. It was loaded. One little incident took place. One of the barrels slipped out of the sling in which it was being transferred from the dock to the hold of the ship, and sank down into the harbor.
Oh no!
And it was necessary to call in Navy divers to locate
but they were able to do so?
And they were able to do so. And at that time there were rumors that this was among the local French population, that this was these barrels were filled with French gold, which the Americans were taking. But we were just as happy that we would rather have them believe it was gold than that it was atomic ore, because we did not want to, at any point, to highlight the importance of the material that we're taking. So I was designated as officer to accompany the American merchant fleet that carried this material back to the United States, and make sure that it came into the hands of the Manhattan Project. And I signed in on the boat as Captain Augustine, and I was in the same boat as the admiral in charge of the whole convoy, and so to my surprise, at dinner that night, I found myself in the captain's dining room, and very near to the admiral himself, and the conversation that ensued made it clear to everybody present that I was not a naval captain, which would be the same grade as an Army colonel, but I was an Army captain, which was about the same as a Navy lieutenant, second grade. And so at that point, why my stock went down faster than that barrel went down in the harbor of Marseille. So the next night after that, I found myself in the dining room of the lower naval officers, the lieutenants, the ensigns, and so forth. But it was a much more congenial group so far as I was concerned, and from that point on, the whole trip was a succession of evening bridge games with the naval officers, and daytime perusing of their extensive shipboard library. When we arrived in Boston, who was there from the Manhattan Project to meet me but Colonel Dance, who had flown on back to the United States, and since he and I knew one another, why it was the easiest transfer that could have been imagined. So when I returned to France, this was in November November and December of 1944, and during this time, the front lines had stabilized along the Rhine River and remained stabilized for a period of 3 months. But in the meantime, the American troops had entered Strasbourg in France, and had in Alsace, I should say, and there was a German research organization connected with a hospital in Strasbourg, and the scientist in charge of their research was very closely connected with the German atomic research organization under Heisenberg, and it was at this point, in perusing his correspondence with the research center in Germany, that our scientists concluded that the Germans not only did not have an atomic bomb, were not likely ever to have one, because they were on the wrong track. However, it was very important for us.
And how was this determined exactly, that they were on the wrong track?
Because their papers showed that they were pursuing the wrong scientific methods of exploding an atomic bomb.
And so you had top American scientists with you who could determine this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I should say at this point that our mission as American military officers at this time was to accompany the American scientists, make sure that they were provided housing and were properly fed, and transportation from one point to another, physical protection, security, and so forth. So our general pattern of action was to move into an area where there was some sort of a target in the form of an installation with its documents and papers and so forth, and the personnel, and exploit so that our science could exploit this material, the information that was available through interrogating the personnel that we came to. And it was through this means that, let's say, our scientists were 99.5% certain that the Germans were not even on the right track. But it was important for us to continue to locate them, to find out, for one thing, whether they made any progress subsequent to the point at which the correspondence had originated that we had just exploited, and also to prevent German scientists from being exploited by the Russians.
About how many men did you have under you?
We had, I would say that Colonel Pash had military personnel amounting to about 35, 40 personnel, and we had at one time or another an equal number of American scientists, but the American scientists, some of them were permanently assigned to our mission and remained with us the entire time that we were in Europe, whereas other scientists were what you might call visiting scientists who came on specific missions to find out what was being progressed. Another point I should make is that our Alsos mission was called the War Department Scientific Intelligence Mission, and it was assigned all sorts of additional missions in order to cover up the atomic element of it. So we found ourselves with people who were interested in German Air Force research, in the bombs, the bombs that the Germans were making and sending over to England at that time.
The V-2 rockets.
V1 and V2 rockets. Also, we had an oil shale man who was interested in German research on the production of gasoline from, or I should say, motor fuel from oil shale, so forth. We had several doctors who were interested in wartime research that the Germans making, especially with Russian prisoners.
And also chemical weapons, right? Biological weapons.
Also chemical weapons, yes, by all means. But all this, I should repeat, this was all cover-up to hide the fact that we were interested in the atomic bomb. One of our number one objectives was to keep anyone, the French, the Russians, from finding out about it, and the only way to do that was to make sure that nobody outside of our mission knew what our mission was, except at the very highest level, the commanding officers, Eisenhower, Strong, his chief of intelligence, and so forth. Some of the very highest military officers were aware of what our objective was, but for the most part, we were very sure that no one, even on the American side, should find out what we were looking for.
Well, and what was the U.S. government going to do with the information about the German atomic program?
As I say, one thing was, of course, to find out what progress from that point on the Germans might make.
Well, presumably it was to find out whether the Germans would, at the very end of the war, be able to use an atomic weapon against the Allies?
Oh, yes.
That must have been the chief goal, right?
Oh, yes. Oh, by all means.
Yeah.
By all means. Yes. As I said at the outset, the objective of the Alsos mission was to find out how far the Germans had progressed, and presumably to take countermeasures to prevent them from exploiting whatever they may have found out.
Right.
Through aerial bombardment of their production facilities or whatever it might be. But this never came into play because the Germans didn't progress that far. As a matter of fact, the scientific chief of our mission, Dr. Sam Godsmith, who had been at the University of Michigan. He was of Dutch origin. Said that we, the Americans, spent more time and money trying to find out what the Germans had done than the Germans spent on their entire program. But this only came clearly into view the deeper we got into the research facilities.
So there wasn't any real serious interest in chemical or biological weapons, right? Is that correct? That there was not the thought, oh, the Germans might deploy chemical or biological weapons in an attempt to win the war at the last minute, and therefore we have to find out about that. That was not really a thought. It was all a cover, basically. Yes,
I'm sure
a cover
our
for
chemists would have reported any evidence, pro or con, on that subject, but to my knowledge, I am not aware of what evidence they did turn up one way or another. Their reports were of course, secret as far as we were concerned.
Right.
Just as ours were secret as far as they were concerned.
Right. So in other words, you weren't involved in the search for chemical or biological weapons, but there were others in the Alsace mission who were.
All we did was, however, we provided them with food, lodging, transportation, and so forth, just the same as we did for those of our scientists who were primarily concerned with the atomic research. That's we treated them all the same in that respect. Naturally, most of our greatest effort was in the direction of atomic, German atomic activity.
Right. So I think you had gotten sidetracked. Let's see, where were we? You were talking about Strasbourg, I think.
When I returned in December of 1944, I was assigned to Strasbourg, and as a matter of fact, I had headquarters established in the apartment of a German doctor who was at that time conducting research on Soviet prisoners of war. And his research facility was in the hills behind Strasbourg, in a place called Natzweiler. And he had a facility where you could house, let's say, a dozen or so Russian prisoners at the same time. He also had a little gas chamber, a one shower gas chamber for use when necessary. and I accompanied our doctors up to that facility a couple of times.
And was this also a cover for the atomic mission, or was there was there some other motive for doing research on these medical experiments?
Well, so far as our medical officers assigned to Alsos, so far as they were concerned, their objective was the very positive one of finding out what the Germans were doing along that line, and just as our main objective was atomic research, I think they were as serious. The officers that were medical officers that were with us had missions that to them were as serious as our mission was to us.
Right.
To put it simply, but in any event, for the next 3 months I was waiting in Strasbourg for the time when the front lines would move across the Rhine, and Strasbourg could be used as a base of operations for all of Alsace into southern Germany.
That must have been very macabre, living in the place where a Nazi war criminal had lived. Must have been very odd, to say the least.
No, as a matter of fact, his family life and home life seemed to be as normal and as wholesome as anyone else's. And you would never guess from what we found in his apartment that related to this. I suppose that all of the material on his medical research was housed in the his little establishment up at Matzweiler, where he had his carving table and his gas chamber and so forth. But in his home there were complete sets of all of the works of Goethe, of Schiller, of Heine, and other famous German poets and thinkers, and that was I would say the major act of liberation that I personally conducted during the war. I sent all of those books back, and they are in my library right at this moment. But when springtime came and military operations were resumed in full, the American troops captured, among other places, Heidelberg. And Heidelberg was a much more suitable place than Strasbourg for conducting research. For one thing, Heidelberg was one of the few German towns that was untouched. It was a university town, did not constitute a military target, and was closer to the front lines, you might say, to the targets that we were interested in, closer to the German networks of highways, the so-called Autobahnen, and which we used to get from our headquarters to the various targets that developed in southern Germany. So from April of 1945 until October of 1945, I was in charge of the base in our operating base in Heidelberg, and there we occupied a mansion, a huge mansion that had belonged to a German beer brewer whose factory was in Mannheim, just a few kilometers away from Heidelberg. And we had plenty of room in that mansion to house dozens and dozens of people at the same time. We also had to naturally house our own military personnel, and for that purpose I had to go out into the neighborhood and requisition German housing, which was no mean task in itself, because every house seemed to be stuffed with refugees from various parts of Germany who had fled from the front lines, and most of the people were either elderly or children. The able-bodied men, of course, were out on the front. So it was women, children, and the elderly that lived in these houses. But obviously, the next objective was to occupy the German atomic research facilities, which in the meantime we had found out were located in the area of Teilfingen, to in the southern part of the German state of Württemberg, so as soon as American and French troops had pushed back the Germans and had occupied the area where those were located, why it became our objective to go into their research facilities, find out exactly what they were doing, and to round up their personnel to make sure that they were did not disperse and fall into Russian hands, or and for, I suppose, for historical purposes, we wanted to know exactly how far they had gone, and what they had found out in the research that they had done, which was quite different from in some respects, from our own. So, when Tailtean and the surrounding towns had been liberated, our commanding officer, Colonel Pash, with a small group of well-armed American GIs who were attached to our mission, made sure that it was safe, and in the meantime, he asked me to bring the American scientists up into that area so that they could perform their task of interrogation and exploitation of these targets. So I was not present with this forward element that had militarily occupied the facilities that we wanted to research, but I formed a little convoy and brought a dozen or so American scientists up into that area, and I returned to Heidelberg, and they spent several days of exploiting that area and reporting on it, and when they were finished, the Colonel Pash asked me to come back and escort them. Asked me to escort the German atomic scientists whom we had captured. There were perhaps a dozen. I've forgotten exactly how many there were, but these were the top people in German atomic research. And since we would have to take them back to American headquarters in Frankfurt am Main, and would have to travel through French-occupied territory to do so, Colonel Pash arranged for me to have a battalion of combat engineers accompany our little convoy of scientists who, so that to any outsider the movement would appear to be a simple movement of American military personnel, and to which no Frenchman could raise any objection. So I've successfully escorted them back to Frankfurt. There was no attempt to interfere in any way on the part of anyone in that little movement.
And what were your...
Then from there, of course, they were moved up into England and were housed for interrogation in England.
Yeah, and that's at Farm Hall.
farm
Right.
hall.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
And
What were your orders? What would have happened if you had run into any resistance on the part of the French?
I was under orders to go through.
Yeah. Okay, that's pretty clear.
I've sometimes speculated just what might have happened, but it's there's you have no way of knowing exactly how such a situation would arise, and no, as a consequence, no point in trying to plan what you would do.
Right.
Obviously, with as much American firepower as I had, why I didn't intend to be interfered with in any way, but so from that point on, there were a few other German scientists located, some in Hamburg, some in Bavaria, some fairly important people. Heisenberg, for example, himself, the leading German atomic scientist in this mission, who was in a mountain retreat in Bavaria and had to be tracked down individually, and I had no part in that. So
But did you ever meet Heisenberg?
I never met Heisenberg.
And you never saw him either?
No, I saw all these others, Professor Hahn, and
Oh, yes.
who was the inventor of the, let's say, or the discoverer of atomic fission, along with Lisa Meitner.
Oh, you saw Lisa Meitner?
No, I'm sorry.
Oh, he along with, that's right,
Yeah.
Lisa Meitner was not in the country, right?
He and Lisa Meitner had, let's say, together come to the conclusion that about atomic fission, but Lisa Meitner had gone on up to Sweden.
Yeah.
And was not captured by the Americans at that time.
What kind of impression did you have of Hahn or any of the others? Do you remember it all? Do you remember anything about them?
No, the German scientists are a very, let's say, a very weighty group, intellectually and to a certain extent socially. With very fine manners, and I had very little contact with them. So from that point on, we're now getting toward the time of the German surrender, and I was not on any important mission until sometime later. From that point on, I was, let's say, in a holding mission. We were in Heidelberg, I simply was in charge of all the facilities there, but I had 3 junior officers, one in charge of the housing, one in charge of the mess, one in charge of the motor pool, and my deputy named Edel, Jack Edel, was the primary dispatcher of, that is, matching up our automotive facilities with individual scientists who were on missions in various places. And I had no direct connection with any important mission, except to go down to Munich when it was captured, and I established a headquarters down there, and I remained there for a week or so to make sure that it was operating all right. But then another officer was sent in to take care of that so that I could get back to Heidelberg. And it was not until August that I got on a final mission, and this was a rather interesting one. Colonel Pash received a cable from Washington saying that the world atomic standards, which had been developed by the Curies but had been conquered or had been confiscated by the Germans when they occupied Paris, and had been removed to a German research facility in what is now, what later became Eastern Germany. And the Americans had initially occupied this particular part of Germany, but through corrections that were made in the line of division, it ultimately fell into the Soviet zone of occupation. And so in order that these atomic standards would not, they were the standards by which all other atomic standards were worldwide were measured. They were in order that these standards should not fall into Soviet hands, but should be in the hands of the Americans and the English. Colonel Pash called one day and said, he called I think about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and it said that by 6 o'clock he wanted a fleet of jeeps ready with so many drivers, so much gasoline. At this point, I should digress just a little bit and say that Colonel Pash had also had his own headquarters in Heidelberg, on the other side of the Neckar River, from where my the headquarters were. Naturally, when Colonel Pash wanted to, he could step in at any time and take charge of any action that he thought appropriate. But for normal day-to-day actions, he did not want to become involved in that. He wanted me and Jack Liddell to handle the normal facilities. So, but Colonel Pash had a half a dozen.
So you were sort of Colonel Pash's right-hand man, is that right?
No, I'd say his two right-hand men were Colonel Ekman, who was in charge of the Paris office and remained in the Paris office during the entire during the duration of our mission into Germany. He had established himself there in the fall of 1944, and that it was through that office that correspondence from Washington passed and was held, and naturally atomic scientists from the United States who are going to come into Germany at any part first of all went to Paris and then were processed there for coming forward into Germany. I should also say that there was a headquarters similar to mine, which was headquarters in Göttingen, somewhat farther north in Germany, and it was commanded by Captain Blake, who was sort of my counterpart, and he ran operations similarly into northern Germany. So there were two different operating headquarters, but the main mass of them passed through Heidelberg. You can say that Göttingen was a forward headquarters for operations only into northern Germany. Well, in any event, now let's stop the digression. By 6 o'clock we were ready with jeeps and weapons and gasoline and all that was necessary, and the necessary number of men. And we traveled all night, and arrived early the next morning at the point in, let's say, eastern Germany, where this research headquarters was. And
you can't say where that was?
I have forgotten the name of the town.
Oh, I see.
Where
okay.
that was, and
that's okay.
It was relatively uneventful.
I mean, it must have presumably been in Saxony or Thuringia somewhere. Has to have been, because those were the areas that were occupied by Americans and later vacated by the Russians. Has to have been Saxony or Thuringia, I think.
You still filming?
I had the impression it might have been Turingen, but I'm not sure. And now, actually, the picking up of this material was rather uneventful. There was naturally some reluctance on the part of the German scientists in charge of the facility, but we had orders to pick them up, so we did pick them up.
Mm-hmm.
And then we headed back to Frankfurt. The interesting thing is that when there were in an office in the American headquarters in Frankfurt, there were a number of people who were eagerly awaiting to find out how this mission had turned out. That there was, I would say, there was more concern about the fate of these atomic standards than I would have imagined that there would be. I was surprised at the importance that was laid upon them, but in any event, when we arrived back, there were people waiting in this office in the Farben building, in IG Farben building in Frankfurt, to find out from Colonel Pash. So when Colonel Pash entered the room where they were, of course they wanted to know where they were, and Colonel Pash dramatically pulled open his coat and showed that he had put them in. And he said that they all ran from the room at that time. They were, because these were live atomic, and it turned out later that he did suffer some burns from
Oh my gosh.
on his body from carrying these things that close. But that's the way he transported them.
My gosh. Did he suffer any long-term health
I don't
repercussions from that?
I don't know. I don't think so.
Well, for example, did he die young of cancer or no? Okay.
No, he lived into his 90s.
Oh, okay. So whatever long-term repercussions there were, they can't have been too bad.
Yeah, he was only 45 when I joined the mission. I think that I think he didn't die until somewhere around 1990, or he was over 90 years old.
Yeah.
So that there was no short term
Yeah.
effect in any event. So the time came when our mission began to phase out, and our personnel was classified, as all American personnel was classified, for further assignment. Those who had had so many points, a person could get points, so many points for so many months, the number of months spent in the Army, so many more points from time overseas, so many more points from combat exposure, and so forth. So it was at that time that I was classified as somebody ready for ready for discharge from the Army. And so we returned to Washington. I was processed out of Washington, and subsequently went up to the Army facility in Rockford, Illinois, where I was, let's say, drummed out of the Army entirely.
Tell me how you got your OED.
Well, there were a number of Englishmen who participated. This was, to a certain extent, a joint venture, and there were certain Englishmen who were very well familiar with our operation, and so when the British were dealing out memberships in the Order of the British Empire, they included Americans who were also in this joint venture, you might say. To what extent that that policy was carried out across the board, I don't know.
And how did you come to get a Bronze Star, an American Bronze Star?
Yes, Colonel. I think Colonel Pash simply nominated certain personnel for, and both Bob Blake and I were given the Bronze Star. Colonel Pash received the Silver Star, and yes, I could have mentioned that that when I was in Strasbourg, one day a party came from Paris to see what facilities were available there, and of course I was living in the facilities that were available there, and there was a British general among those who came forward, and so I had my driver take us around to various parts of Strasbourg, show him what the town was like, as well as our own building, our own headquarters, and it was then that he asked me to drive him down to the Rhine River